Professor Frances Spalding addresses three important questions in her lecture. What is the quality or presence that questions and inspires sacred art? How do we distinguish the sacred? And what makes art sacred? I don't feel that the lecture thoroughly answered these questions for me, so I started looking up the definition and kind of pondering over it to help me better understand what her questions and thoughts were. I found that sacred is something dedicated for or to some religious purpose. It's also defined as being made holy by its association with other objects of worship. It is a place or object regarded with respect, and its reverence is similar to that which attaches to holy things. I referred back to this definition numerous times during my request of understanding the professor's theories while I was developing my own sense of sacred. So I'm going to be quoting this definition as I go through the presentation, just so it'll be easier for you to help follow along. In her lecture, she uses this example of John Ruskin's watercolor paintings of a peacock feather and states that Ruskin was inspired by his belief that God created all of nature, and therefore this communicates the power and beauty of divinity. But Spalding insists that divine, inspired, does not always make an object or place sacred. So this doesn't really answer the question of what the quality or presence that inspires sacred art. So in order to resolve this, I looked up some objects online of nature, and I had an idea from one of the images that Professor Spalding had shown during her lecture. What do you see when you look at these simple stones? Do you see familiar shape, color, texture, pattern, size? Although these are God-made objects, it was kind of difficult for me to relate to them in a sacred sense. I really didn't feel much of an emotional connection when I was processing the image, so this is certainly not what is defined as, quote, an object regarded with respect as it was defined to me. Now, what do you see when you look at these stones? Do you take an automatic survey of shape, size, color, patterns, etc.? Or are you focusing more on the relationship that the objects have with the water, the trees, the charming little spectral cottage in the background? To me, I would certainly define this as a, quote, place regarded with respect, unquote. When I look at it, it reminds me that God has beautifully provided for all humans with all of his or her needs, which is quite recognizable here. I consider the place to be a majestic sight, and that to me is sacred. But my question to you was, are the stones sacred? I'm going to show you one more example. What do you see or feel when you look at these simple stones? Do you have more of a visual response to the object? Shapes, colors, patterns, etc.? Or is it an emotional response to the placement and the form? For example, do you feel peace, comfort, warmth, love, awe, respect, blessed, humbled? Aren't these descriptive words ones that would give you a sense of sacred? The sacred art does involve both the artist and the viewer to contribute to equal awareness. Both need to understand and relate to the experience that would evoke the sanctity of emotion. And like divinity, it surpasses a location or setting. It's really accomplished through an association of both the object and the form. I want to share one last image of stones with you. I look at these stones and I needed to ask myself, is this, quote, dedicated for or to some religious purpose? Is it, quote, a place or an object that is regarded with some respect? Well, the positions and the placement of the stones were obviously done purposefully, and the form is associated in the context, and that would heighten the sacred experience. It may seem like a stretch to some that I'm arguing that both that a bunch of rocks are sacred based simply on this definition and my perspective. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a painting that Frances Spalding had used during her lecture, and I really think that she successfully conveyed the same idea. Now, at first glance, someone might look at this piece of artwork done by Alison Watt and say, this is nothing but a 4-panel painting of wrinkled white fabric. However, aren't the cascading folds of pleats and tucks and light cloth kind of reminiscent of a pattern found in examples of religious art? Clothes, sheets, veils. There's a strong iconic relationship with classic religious art and the subject in Watt's painting. The most prolific argument to this being sacred art is the location and placement. This modern painting adorns the wall of the memorial chapter, which is located inside the old St. Paul Church of London. Spalding quotes the artist who painted this in her lecture. She says, "I worked on still in my studio for about a year, visiting old St. Paul's almost every day. I needed to go back again and again to the memorial chapter to remind myself of the space." This painting shares the space within the memorial that is dedicated for the old St. Paul worshippers who lost their lives in the First and Second World War. So one must ask themselves, does this spectacular example of art answer all of Professor Spalding's questions? Does it convey the quality of presence of art that has been divinely inspired? Is it distinguishable as sacred? If so, what makes the painting sacred? My answer to this would be emphatically yes. Watt's work exudes visual quality through subject, form, skill. The artist admits to routinely standing in the sacred home where the piece would be eventually housed, and she did this for divine inspiration and direction. The painting was also dedicated for a religious purpose, and it is made holy by its association with other objects of worship, reference, and of course, its location. But why do we find pieces of art like this in a church that's over 400 years old? The liturgical movement, which started in the mid-19th century, sought new ways of expressing the sacred and present religion within the Roman Catholic Church. Major developments in liturgy were widely recognizable during the late 1950s and 60s. Some changes were innovative, yet small, such as bringing forward the altar in the celebration of Mass directly with the congregation. Some of them were large changes, very large changes. Church's architecture began to evolve as early as the 20th century. There's not enough time for me to thoroughly examine all of the examples in the research that I've done, so I'm going to cut them down. The clerical artist, Father Courtier, commissioned the first modern concrete and abstract stained glass church, which was built in 1932. The concept of the church of Notre Dame du Raincy in France was an elegant style with minimalized decor and to evoke temperance. The priest also commissioned the chapel of Notre Dame du Hat in Rocham, France, which was completed in 1955. According to Frances Spalding, the liturgical movement desired a return to the Christian qualities of poverty, humility, and simplicity, and become once again places of silence, reflection, and prayer. But my only concern with that is, why did this ever been abandoned by the Roman Church to begin with? There's a few places in Houston that I've been to that convey this level of peace and modesty and contemplation that I want to share with you. This is the Rothko Chapel, and it's designed with 7 hard-edged rectangle canvases that are laid with textures of deep purple tone. This is a local chapel that is nicknamed the Glass Chapel, and it's nestled in the middle of a meadow which is surrounded by old large trees and greeneries that can be seen by all three surrounding clear glass walls. Although I'm a Christian, I appreciate that both of those chapels that I've given you an examples of serve our diverse community without religious artifacts, and they can function as a sacred space for a person of any faith. Now, I'm an abstract expressionist, so the connection for me is in a sacred pace is more of a sense of prominent colors and light within the space. Marguerite Hure's abstract design of glass, seen here, was created in the 1950s in the baptistry window of the New Coventry Cathedral. Its remarkable blazes of vivid lights fill the space with a wide spectrum of beauty. Each window contains a distinctive abstract design. The unique rays of color come together to form one beautiful effect. I look at this as if it's God taking all of our individual lives and creating a cohesive bond of unity with Him as the center. When I look at it, I see a round glowing blaze of yellow, golds, and oranges, and that representing God is us taking His grace and shining it in with Him and beaming into the room of divinity. Here's a few examples of modern churches. The one on the left reminded me of Dan Flavin's exhibit hall in Houston, which is, you can see the picture up on the top right-hand corner. The large room that displays Flavin's installation is completely empty, quiet, and surreal. It's void of all architectural features other than the reflective glow of the neon lights, and those mirror upon the shiny walls and floors, as well as anyone else who encounters them while they're within the space. Us Houstonians do not go to casually see Flavin or Rothko's famous work, just as Europeans do not go to simply look at modern churches. We go there to experience them. There's a link that occurs between the individual, the creator, and of all things, and the designer of art and space, which makes the moment sacred. The occasion is a personal, introspective, and enlightening, joyful yet poignant moment that makes a place or art sacred to that individual. Here's a few links that you can go to see some more modern churches, and there's also a video link that will show you a little bit more about the Church of Notre Dame du Raincy. It's worth your time looking at.
Continuing on with Kim's story by James Elkins. James Elkins argues that there is no religion in modern art. Therefore, Kim's art will not be accepted by the art world. Outside of the art world, however, religious art is ubiquitous, and he uses the popularity of this image as an example. Religious institutions display modern art, though many of them that do are not typical places of worship. Outside of a few popular examples, Matisse, Rothko, and Louise Nevelson, there are a few well-known modern and contemporary artists who will make work for religious purposes. It is extremely difficult to claim that popular religious art has a place in the history of modernism and postmodernism. Through his experience in jurying exhibitions such as Revelations, Artists Look at Religions, Elkins concludes that piety goes against what is interesting about the current practice of making art. That's why you see a lot of attitudes towards religion that are of hate, uncertainty, and skepticism in the art world. After the reading, I was contemplating this idea of modernism and realized that it's not just about being anti-religious, but just simply about breaking down barriers and listening to new perspectives, the atheists and the skeptics, but not just them, also about listening to those who are devoutly religious, but simply practicing different religions, religions we've never heard of before. I think Pope Francis is considered such a modern man because he also does this, where he breaks down barriers and is not just appealing to those who practice Catholicism. I was frustrated, however, about the story where Elkins was during this religious art exhibition, and when they came across two entries that were both visually interesting and compelling on a modernist level, they were rejected because they were made by a nun and a monk. At the end of the text, I was questioning who this Olga Toberlut's Russian neo-academic artist was, and so after looking up some of her artwork, I found myself disagreeing with Elkin's assertion that her work is too sentimental and too serious for the contemporary art world. And there will be a question about her work in the neo-academics at the end. Moving on to Daniel Seidel's God in the Gallery, A History of Modern Art. Some main points here, and I do want to make a side note that this was one of my favorite texts. There was a lot of really great information in this chapter, so this is just a speedy list here. He claims that modernism was introduced to the American public with the 1913 Armory Show, and he compares Marcel Duchamp in modern degeneracy to Cyrano and Ophelia in contemporary corruption. He also brings up his character Alfred Barr, who in 1941 proposed an exhibition entitled The Religious Spirit in Contemporary Art. And interestingly enough, this art historian was interested equally in Christianity and modern art. And Seidel also makes a connection that modernist art is art that addresses itself, and it's concerned with the immediacy of its aesthetics. Modernist art is often dismissed by Christian commentators because it appears to go against Christian concepts of humanity. It can be challenging. And then I also really appreciated the sociological point of view of modernity and religion here. He begins to explain how secularization of modernity is explained in sociology, but then brings up this Peter Berger, who's a sociologist, that asserts that the world is massively religious. So in conclusion, Seidel says that modern art requires creative and critical reception, and with this, modern art cannot be deemed Christian or anti-Christian. For this reading, I'd like to center my thoughts and frustrations and questions around this particular piece of artwork that was mentioned in the Seidel chapter. This is Gustave Courbet's The Studio of the Painter. And Courbet had crossed my mind when reading the Elkins text. I was really pleased to see this enter the discussion in God in the Gallery, especially with this painting, because it's a personal favorite of mine, but it's loaded with symbolism regarding the artist's attitude toward modernism and the academy itself. And I love the connection between the artist's immediate impression on the little boy and the aesthetic immediacy sought after in modern art. My frustrations have to deal with the avant-garde itself. I wonder, is it like the new academy? Is this the new jury to which one seeks approval to be an artist? And my questions revolve around this beautiful statement that all things are good if received with gratitude. Can this be put into practice when we look at some of art's most challenging pieces? If at once Courbet's work was considered scandalous, and we now find appreciation in it, will works like Cyrano's Piss Christ find the same redemption? Moving on to Dearness, Visual Faith, Art and Theology, and Worship and Dialogue. A few main points from this chapter deal with what Scripture says about art and beauty. He claims that both testaments support the view that beauty and goodness have theological grounding. Beauty is inherent from God. This statement also contrasts with what he says is the modern and postmodern idea of beauty. He claims that biblical imagery and its historical influence on art are abundant, and the images of the death of Christ are very popular in art history. He also goes on to compare and contrast modernism and modern ideas of beauty on the left to Old Testament ideas of beauty on the right. He says that modernism is narrow and restrictive. It's all about appearance and the visual, and he claims that the Old Testament ideas of beauty are broad and inclusive. They are not just about beauty, but also meaning, and also light, color, sound, and taste, not just the visual. Some thoughts I had dealing with the dearness text. I thought it was interesting to look at the language that was used in the Old Testament. It's a nice demonstration of how Scripture affects the way Christians view and create beauty. I was frustrated, however, with the narrow view of how others besides the Old Testament Christians view beauty. On page 80, he argues that the supreme beauty is found in flowers. And I thought that was a little cliche. I think if you ask somebody to think of something beautiful, the first thing that comes into their head is not always going to be flowers. It might be something like Marilyn Monroe or the Venus de Milo. I also felt towards the end, I was questioning what his stance really was on modernism and beauty, because towards the beginning of the chapter on page 70, he argues that modernism has come to open the definition of beauty to a more conceptual level. But then he also concludes that modernism, modern ideas of beauty are narrow and strictly visual. So I found that to be a little confusing. Well, this concludes our presentation. I'll let you pause through the next slides at your leisure. We have our vocabulary, summaries, and here are the questions we'd like you to reflect on for this week's discussion. And we'll also post them in the forum this week. Thank you for listening.